development background. And so for the past few years, I've been looking at extracting workflow data from ticketing systems to gain insights into how organizations interact with work. And I've been using those insights to both reflect status across teams and projects, help organizations predict completion dates for projects, and capacity plan quarter over quarter. And recently, I've been looking at using that data to both budget very early in the project cycle and also track costs, the burn rate for costs as projects are progressing. So like most of my presentations, this is sort of just a snapshot of where I'm at with that kind of work. Having been through several organizations, I generally find that there are three systems for tracking projects. There's Clarity or some kind of hour tracking system. There's JIRA or some kind of ticketing system for managing scope. And there's some sort of PAR process where people go to beg for money to get things done. The least defined of all of them. For our purposes, we're going to focus in on JIRA for the scope and Clarity for the cost. Each system is kind of in a dichotomy relationship where we have scope without costs and we have costs without scope. And it's all dependent on developers bridging that somehow, honestly. So this is developers doing work at in an organization that might be using some of the stuff that we just learned about, where we have issues over epics, managing initiatives or programs or something along of that nature. And if an organization is smart enough to try to connect one-to-one the money they got with a ticket in JIRA that represents all the work necessary to get that out, they're in a good position to be able to start rolling up costing in JIRA. So let's take a look at developers entering time. This is basically, it's a very lonely situation sitting at your desk as a developer, trying to remember what you did and plug in those hours in the costing system that doesn't exactly match the language in JIRA or anywhere else in the organization. So they might put 5 hours in for project 1, 20 for 2, 15 for 3, if they're interested in actually breaking it out like that. I never was. So we could look in JIRA. So the thing about developers is that if they have good JIRA hygiene, if an organization really engages with JIRA in basically an honest way, we know what a developer was working on when, because we know the WIP states for that story. And a basic calculation we can run is, hey, how much does a developer cost per day, and how many days did they spend on that story? And we come up with a calculation that would be the cost for that story. So that's great, except developers might have multiple stories in flight at any given time, and so you need to serialize the developer's fixed cost per day across the stories that they have as WIP for any given day. And so here you might look at this center line right, or I haven't got the pointer, but you look at the center line, there's 3 things in process on that day. So how do we serialize a developer's time? And this is the edge of where I'm at. This is the stuff I'm working on right now, but I like coming up with simple formulas that kind of mimic the way people just think, because if you look at how people think, they're not that complicated. They use basically simple formulas to figure out how to resolve issues like this. So we might go, the formula we're going to use is starting a story trumps continuing a story. Because there was an action by the developer, you assume if they drag it in process, but they've already got some WIP, they're likely working on that story. Finishing trumps continuing. If they close a story out, it's likely that they did some work on that to make that happen, even if they have work in process. And starting trumps finishing. Because I think it's more likely that a story was hanging out and they just closed it right then and then started a story. Your results may vary, so figure out what your developers do and try to encode it, and then try to get people to follow those behaviors. There's a little bit of behavior modification here as well. So if we do that, then we have a serialized view of what the developer was working on when, by project, if you've got it structured in a way like you just saw. So this is, I'm like an OG nerd, so my tooling is very text heavy and basic, but this is this is where I'm at with the algorithms that I've been working on. So I can extract workflow data from JIRA, I can run a query which is ls recursively of all the type scope and pipe it to the cost command, and it'll break out for all of the scope returned by that query, which is for delivery 140, which is basically an initiative, which you guys just heard about. So there's lots of epics and lots of teams involved, and it'll start breaking it out. It says it's using a daily rate of 720. We know that in JIRA there's 269 stories. We know that of those stories, 198 are done. We know that there's 71 of them are still to do on this project. And I've also got my predictive metrics in there, which is predicting that there's going to be 17 additional stories that the teams are likely to create based on how they break down work historically. Then we estimate the total scope, which is predicted future plus the stuff we know about, and we think there's going to be 286 stories by the end of this project. The average cycle time for a story is 5. We start looking at the rate times the cycle time. That's the cost per story for this project. And then we can say, okay, we've got sunk costs of about $700,000. That's the scope we've done. We've got known future costs, the scope we know about, of about $250,000. And we're predicting about an additional $61,000 that isn't even in JIRA yet. And from there, we can go combine future costs, 316, and then the estimated total project cost is about $1 million. And we can run this whenever we want. So we can create a flow of understanding how our burn rate is going with this kind of tool. And this is where so this is a chart that I have from another presentation. I just threw it in there because you guys did an initiatives presentation. So this chart would show a swim lane for each initiative you're working on, the backlog for that initiative over time. So the top one is showing at April, they started an initiative, they completed it sometime in October, and that was what was in the to-do column. So it's cumulative flow just at the to-do column. And you can see that the scope spiked up, and then it burned out, and they completed the project. Well, throughout that time that you're running that project, you can be running these costing, and you should hit an inflection point at the middle where you've completed half your scope, and you've burned through half your money. And if halfway through the project that's not true, you get to make some decisions early, right? About the amount of scope, about the amount of capacity you have allocated to it, those kinds of things. So a lot of what I'm doing is using workflow data to move decisions as early in the cycle as possible, using some data to facilitate the conversations. Another thing that I can do is break the costs out by developer. So I've erased the names. This is actual data, but I've blown the names out. I can extract the names as well, but we can see developer number 1 has 121 days of cycle time on this project across 14 stories, and I have 2 different costing formulas I'm playing with. The one on the left is the real one, that's the winner. But it'll tell you basically the cost sunk by developer. You can do those kinds of things as well. So the other thing you can do is start to develop a language of cost within the organization. You know your average story cost. If you have a story, it's going to cost you about $3,000 to get it out. You can start thinking in those terms. If you have an epic, it's going to cost you about $30,000 to get it out. And if you've got an initiative, maybe $300,000. You can start to figure out basically what things look like based on the sizes that they are, with the issues and epics and so forth associated with it. And just looking at a project, you get a ballpark figure in your head. So this is some correlations I've done between Clarity and JIRA. So using the costing formula I just showed you, we've got what JIRA in gray predicts or believes that the project cost and what Clarity believes it costs. And you can see there's a correlation there, right? Stronger on some projects, not on others. There are some issues with projects that are older that people have cannibalized the stories out of them and so forth, so the data becomes less accurate. And this is the cost per story based on some calculations, data out of Clarity, data out of JIRA. Still, there's some correlation there. It's promising, right? So why might that be true? And I think this is why. Because when a developer is looking at Clarity, they're going, what was I doing? And they're thinking about JIRA, right? So project 1, yeah, I closed that ticket. Project 2, I closed that ticket. I think JIRA is really the base reality of what developers think about when they're reporting into Clarity, and Clarity is this real pain in the butt that they just want to get done with. So JIRA is actually the more accurate measure of what projects are costing, which is lucky because there's a lot of things you can do with that data to then estimate future costs. That's it. Thank you. Questions on that?
Have you done any of this sort of work in Tempo budget, Tempo Nachi?
Nope. Nope. Is that, I've heard of Tempo, is it like a clarity system, or is it?
It's JIRA-centric.
Yep.
And it does a lot of, it does budgeting, timesheet, such.
Yep.
So that you can pull the costing data right out of it. It's all in.
Yeah, anything that requires someone to enter a number, I'm trying to eliminate. Yep. Anything else?
So essentially deriving how much time was spent on the story by just looking at whether the thing got closed, the thing got started, etc. Right?
I think so. Yeah,
those are the
exactly. Right.
Those are the correlations, formulas at the beginning.
Yep.
The rules. Okay.
Yep.
Well, speaking, just piggybacking on that, speaking as somebody who keeps away tickets open all the time, one of the things is perhaps you could have additional inflection points by adding, like when somebody's adding comments, adding labels, basically activity in the ticket.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you can also potentially look at code check-ins.
Yes.
Really do introspection on that ticket and figure out what the important data is. I haven't pushed it there yet, but yeah, that's absolutely right. Yep.
I was going to ask if you had any experience using sort of full slice tickets that have QA involved or UX involved, so that if we go sharing tickets, maybe they're not sharing tasks, but they're sharing tickets. Do we then enter the actual time spent as opposed to like the Fibonacci number?
Actual times, well, yeah, so potentially different people will be touching a ticket. I like to go simple when I can. So if multiple people are touching a ticket, it doesn't actually affect the daily rate of that ticket, right? Because the developer's cost is fixed. So if a QA person touches it in the morning, or a developer touches it in the morning and QA touches it in the app, it's still the same money, right? I think.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Not if you're using third-party testing. That's true.
What is it?
Not if you're using third-party testing.
Yeah, yep, that will be a different case. Yep. You had one in the back?
Yeah, do you end up having to pull out the ones that have a ridiculously long cycle time for the tickets that are
Right.
lots of wait time?
That's where the Agile coach comes in, and I'm like, just fix your process. Get the data right, use different charts, use cycle time control charts to pay attention to those tickets and get your data right. So it's going to take you 6 months to collect a history of data and to prove out some of these models. But after that, you should have a pretty tight understanding of what
I
you're
guess
doing.
I find that with some sorts of work, you end up with lots of wait time.
Yep, yep. Any number of things could screw this up. Yep.
Any more questions? No one struggling with JIRA budgeting?
But I will say that that does not stop a developer from putting in 8 hours. Is that it? All right.
All right, thanks. Nice job.